hear me if I just am talking now without the microphone? So we have a microphone here if anybody's voice needs amplification, but why don't we go without it to start? Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Annie Rawlings, and I have been the Prepare New York Education Director for the Interfaith Center of New York. And this program is a jointly sponsored event between Prepare New York and the Interfaith Center and Lebanese American University. Just a very quick word about Prepare New York. Prepare New York has been an initiative that has a connection to the 10th anniversary of September 11th and has sought to really celebrate the diversity of New York City, in particular the religious diversity, and to also in particular build ties of solidarity, friendship, and understanding in relationship to the Muslim and Sikh communities who have been inaccurately blamed and harassed to tragic degrees in association with the attacks. And I'm happy to say that while much work remains to be done, we discovered over the anniversary weekend of 9/11 that many communities had an impulse to come together across lines of faith and across other community lines to really affirm our bonds as neighbors in New York City. The work's not completed, and of course, many communities experience religious-based violence, not only the Muslim community. There have been recent anti-Semitic acts in both Queens and Brooklyn, and so it's always important for us to affirm our friendship and our solidarity with others who are singled out for through acts of hatred. We have been holding a series of community events all over the city as part of Prepare New York. And earlier, last spring, I think we had a flyer in the elevator advertising one of those events, and it was through that flyer that Ed Shiner from Lebanese American University contacted me, and we started talking about, I learned about this amazing exhibit, and I hope you will all take the time to look at the photographs. And then we started talking about doing this panel. You know, lunchtime is an iffy time to do a program, but I'm so glad to see how many of you are here. And so we have the great opportunity to hear from three wonderful speakers this morning or this afternoon, and I'm so grateful to all of them for coming and participating. And so to my immediate left is Sister Chala Marie Hill from the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary. Next to her is Dr. Sarah Sayeed, actually my colleague in the Interfaith Center of New York. And next to her is Mrs. Bronya Shaffer from Chabad. And so we will start with Sister Chala, and I've asked them each to just say a few words about their organizations as a way of introducing themselves, and anything else you want to say by introduction. And then I just asked them to talk about what sort of the experience of wearing a head covering of some kind means to them. I mean, however they want to present it. I can say that for myself, as a Christian woman who comes from a tradition where that's not done, I know that I've gone along quite a journey from absolute misunderstanding and inaccurate assumptions to a posture of admiration and even a little envy. So, with that said, I will welcome Sister Chala's words.
Okay, good afternoon. I am Sister Chala Marie Hill with the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary. Our religious congregation was founded in 1916 in Savannah, Georgia, and in 1922 we were invited up to New York for a ministry of providing care for mothers who were working. That was the time of the Great Migration to the North, and there were many people who had begun working and had no one to care for their children, so that we were invited up by the Archdiocese of New York. The Cardinal actually invited us to move to New York to provide this kind of care. So we are in ministry in Harlem with early childhood education, and most of our endeavors, our ministries, are around peace and justice issues.
And then you can continue your remarks, and everyone else will just introduce themselves before they speak.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, and our congregation wears what's called the modified habit, but as part of that habit is the veil. I remember as coming in as a postulant, a candidate, as I was introduced to the congregation and then became a novice, the feeling of getting the veil, and some people use the term taking the veil. And for me, it meant really being part of this religious congregation. And traditionally, the wearing of the veil or wearing of a head covering goes back to our Jewish roots, because Catholics and Christians come from Jewish roots. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, all pictures that you see as she's depicted, always with the veil. But veils were worn traditionally for virgins, consecrated virgins. Veils were worn widows. Veils were worn married women also. And in each instance, they were saying, we're not available for marriage. But when the religious takes on the veil as part of her habit, the veil also signifies that consecration to Christ. The veil is into the church. The veil is an outward sign of an inward reality, and the reality of what it is that I say, how I want to live. My dedication to God and my dedication to helping my brothers and sisters in need, however that may be. My experience of wearing a veil I've had such varied experiences. People see me and will say, God bless you, or sometimes make the sign of the cross. And those experiences for me are very humbling, because I look at them and say, I should, as I saw you, say, God bless you. You know, but they're seeing me. The other thing is that it raises people's minds to God. It's very interesting, because living in Harlem and sometimes passing some of the street corners, the conversations that people may have, and they will say, do you see sister coming? Well, they see the veil first, and their attitude changes, what they're saying. Some words, the first letter may be out, that first, and you know what was coming after, but it stops. And so it makes people become more aware. But the other side of that is I've also been challenged by the wearing of the veil. How could you be Catholic? How can you be Christian? Don't you know what society has done to you and your people, and you're following a religion that perpetuated this? So I've been also, as I say, challenged. And that gives me an opportunity to speak about my faith, my belief, and to say to people, what people do, that's not the faith, that's not the religion. That is individuals. And whatever wrong an individual does or has done, we can't blame a whole faith tradition on that. And I'm sure the other panelists have had that same experience of trying to explain that to people. And I've also, as a result, because people see the veil first, particularly winter, I have the coat on, they don't see anything else, they see the veil. I've had the opportunity to minister to people that I wouldn't have had the opportunity in other instances. I blessed cars, blessed babies, stopped and prayed, people who are in really horrendous situations, some homeless, some abused, some lonely, whatever, and we have so many ills, societal ills, but people will stop and they see me and say, pray for me. Will you pray for me? And usually I stop right there. What is your name? And I can pray with them there. So I know that wearing the veil for me really gives me the opportunity to minister to my brothers and sisters in a way that as a religious without the veil, I might not have that opportunity. But for me, wearing the veil, when I was looking for congregations, I actually looked for one that did have an outward sign other than a cross or a pin, something that was identifiable. Because I wanted to, in my gift of self to God and to mankind, I wanted to be identifiable and be recognized. So it's been a positive experience. It's been a humbling experience. It's really been a learning experience, and gives me a chance to evangelize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chala.
So my name is Sayeed, and I work for the Interfaith Center of New York here at the 5th floor. I'm also the president of a Muslim women's organization called Women in Islam. It's a Muslim women's human rights organization. And I guess it's probably, there are different ways to go about talking about the veil, but I thought I'd just start with my own personal journey. I didn't always cover my hair. I was born in India, and my parents immigrated to the States when I was about 8 years old. And my mother did cover her hair, but my parents didn't kind of make us cover our hair. There are 4 girls in the family, and they really left it to our choice as to whether or not we want to cover. But I have to say that they did instruct us to dress modestly. And this whole idea of what modesty means is something that, you know, people define in different ways. And for my parents, it really meant at the time that we wear long sleeve shirts and that we cover our legs. It didn't mean that we should cover our hair. I think they wanted to leave that to us to choose whether we wanted to take that step. Then I kind of went along, and growing up, I think the whole idea of modest dress, as I'm sure it is for girls who are veiling, I mean, that was definitely a point of questioning in my growing up years here in this culture, because I saw everyone around me was not following that norm. And, you know, when you're a teenager, you want to fit in, you want to look like everyone else. So, you know, I wanted to dress like other people, but I knew I couldn't. So that was definitely something that I had to navigate over the years. And I guess it was really after my college years and after graduate school and when I became a mother that I started to think about myself in a new way, and thought about what I looked like to this child that I was going to be, you know, raising, and what kind of message I wanted to give him. And it was through that experience that I really started to think about myself as covering my hair. And that's when I actually did start to cover my hair. And I did it gradually, like I would just practice a little bit here and there and see what it felt like. And then, you know, eventually I came to a point where I decided I wanted to cover my hair whenever, you know, I was away from family outside the house. So it's definitely been a journey, and I think it's always so interesting to me that, and I guess this is particularly true for Muslims and the practice of covering one's hair. It's always so interesting that, you know, a cloth that has such little weight is laden with such heavy meaning, and so many different kinds of meanings. And I think one of the things a couple of things I just wanted to say today. One is that, you know, we often make the assumption, I think, that covering one's body is there's a relationship between that and choice. And we often assume that it's an inverse relationship, meaning that the more a woman is covered up, we assume the less choice she has in the matter. Just seeing, you know, just looking at photographs around us, we often assume that the woman who's covering her face has the least amount of choice. The woman who's covering the least has the most choice. And I wanted us to just think about how we conceptualize that relationship, because the nature of that relationship determines, if we believe that to be true, that the more you're covered, the less choice you have, it impacts a lot of ways in which we see things, decisions we make, how we think about women, what kinds of ways we advocate for women. It impacts policy choices that we're making on a global scale. So just to think carefully, is that relationship always true? Is it true that a woman who covers her face and maybe even everything on her face and her body, does she really have less choice? And is it true that the woman who's totally uncovered has the greatest amount of choice? And I wanted to raise in this kind of cultural context of where we live in a capitalistic kind of democratic context, to think about how corporations impact our choice of dress. And whether that's really freeing us up to choose what we wear, because all of us, except for perhaps sisters who have, a full uniform, we're all being, imposed upon by the choices we're given when we go shopping, right? So someone else is choosing for us what we can wear at any given moment. So just to kind of think about that a little bit more, and inviting, us all to think about that as we're kind of going about thinking about this issue of veiling. And then, of course, head coverings are part of many different traditions, and that's the point of this exhibit. And they all have different meanings in different traditions. But can we think about what is common or underlying these traditions that, talks about covering or encourages covering? And is it really about this notion that women are lesser in some way? Or is it about women being better, or what is it really talking about? So just to kind of think about that a little bit more. And I wanted to say that for Muslim women in particular, certainly I think the veil can be a symbol of oppression. It can be a symbol of control. There are parts of the world where women don't have the ability to choose whether or not to cover, in that they are socially mandated or legally mandated to cover, and if they don't, there are legal repercussions for those choices. So there is a professor named Laila Ahmed who's written a book called The Quiet Revolution, which is talking about the practice of veiling and how it's re-emerged among Muslim women. And she writes that in a country where you're free to choose to wear the veil, its meanings are a world away from what it means when you are forced to wear it. So the meaning of covering can mean different things in different contexts. And she says the veil has no universal meaning, and its meanings are always local. What I wanted to add is just that I think that it's not about just one meaning. A veil doesn't have one meaning. It's possible for one person to wear the veil for multiple reasons, right? It could be that part of it could be that someone's telling her she has to, but it could also be it could be her that she wants to. Both of those things could be true at the same time. And someone might not fully choose to wear the veil, but there might be aspects of that experience of covering that she really likes, or that she benefits from. And there might be aspects of that experience that she doesn't like so much. Same for if you choose to cover, there are aspects of this experience of covering my hair that I really enjoy. I think that it makes me feel spiritually content. It makes me feel beautiful, right? But it can also be true that if I have an encounter where someone is rejecting me for covering, that's an experience of the veil that I don't enjoy, right? So a veil can have multiple meanings for one person at any given moment. So I think I wanted to just encourage that we think about it in that nuanced way. And also I wanted to also say that at the end of the day, for me, one of the great things about working in an interfaith context and for women who choose to cover is that I think that there could be a universal meaning for women who are choosing to cover their hair, which is that it is a choice about choosing to express their spiritual identity through a mode of dress, right? And that can be a unifying thing across our faith traditions, and that it's an expression of my own spirituality, and it reminds me about who I am, and certainly it reminds other people about who we are as human beings here on earth and why we were put here. So I think those kinds of things could be universally shared across our faith traditions. Thank you.
have you, Mrs. Shaffer.
Thank you. It's a little bit daunting following the talks of my two colleagues here, co-panelists.
Do you want to use
But I'll
the,
do-
can you hear her?
No,
No, they can.
oh gosh, okay, I do have
Here.
a problem with speaking loudly. Thank you. And sometimes this is more uncomfortable, but is this okay now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, so I'm here to represent Torah Judaism, what the Jewish law says about hair covering for Jewish women. And it's actually very simple. Just the law is that once a Jewish woman marries, she's mandated to cover her hair no differently from the way she's mandated to cover the rest of her body. Basically, her hair takes on the same property as her body that is covered for the general public and for the privacy of herself and in her relationship with her husband alone. So as far as Jewish law goes, it's covering her hair, and the hair covering, how she covers her hair, is dependent on a multitude of factors: cultural, geographic, societal, personal. I actually did spend a little bit more time this morning getting dressed than I usually do, because I had to decide which hair covering was I going to come here in. A hat, a scarf, a wig. The choice is obvious, and I did decide to wear a wig, and that's completely personal. How I decide to cover my hair is completely personal. When I first got married, I did feel before I got married that my one mark of beauty was my hair. I had long, blonde, rich hair, and I thought that's the only thing about me that was beautiful. So thinking that I had to cover it took a deep breath before I actually thought about it. But I was committed to Jewish law and living a Torah, and Torah's core to my life. So I knew that was something I was going to do. Not entirely happily at first, but nonetheless something that I fully accepted, and personally felt that the only way I was comfortable covering my hair was with something other than hair. A scarf, I'm admiring your veil very much, and I would, for years, and actually have quite a collection of different places I've been to and gifts that I've received, but for years would just try different hats, different scarves. My personal preference for many, many years has been just a scarf that was comfortable to wear and something that was very beautiful. And on my husband's travels, he traveled much, he would often bring scarves from different parts of the world that I enjoyed very much. But then sometimes it would just be very practical, being someplace where I just wanted to not feel, or it wasn't even about the way in which I was seen, but getting more comfortable with wearing other kinds of hair. And my children laugh when I would say, no, let me just take off my hair and then I'll have a cup of coffee or something. But I did start wearing wigs. Tried first something that was as close as possible to my hair. Realized that wasn't happening. And then just tried to experience whatever I felt was comfortable. For myself, feeling that I can express who I was in my clothing, in my attire, was extremely important. And my commitment to Jewish law meant simply that I had to be dressed, of course, modestly. Although, interestingly enough, growing up, I never heard of it from my parents. I never heard of it as dressing modestly, but rather in a dignified way. So it was about self-dignity and projecting self-dignity. And that was very much so as a teenager, realizing that there was much that I saw that I loved and could incorporate into my wardrobe, and also much that I felt was kind of demeaning to me as a woman, as a girl, as a woman. So I did certainly feel that expressing who I was, I could do through fashion, as long as I once told my daughters, as long as it had a front and a back and a top and a bottom, do whatever you want. And this was, you know, as I was watching fashion go, backless and frontless and topless, etc. So once it had those components, then it was really a matter of personal style, personal expression. I've dealt a lot, of course, with misconceptions. And very often the misconception is that the reason a woman covers her hair is to make herself less attractive. Because I've often heard, well, some wigs are so much more beautiful than one's hair. Well, yes, indeed, that's true. And sometimes I finish getting dressed, I shower, get dressed, put on the wig, and I feel, oh, wow, you know, no bad hair days. And that certainly is something which is, you know, often crosses lines of reality, because it's not about being unattractive, of course. Covering my hair is just the same way I cover my body. My hair is another article, my wig is another article of clothing. And we cover not to make ourselves unattractive. Indeed, I would venture that most people are decidedly more attractive dressed than un. So therefore, it's not about being, you know, less or more attractive. That's, you know, of course, and then there's the reality of crossing lines between dressing nicely, dressing attractively, being provocative, and it's a matter of personal taste. It's certainly not within the principles of Judaism by which I live to be provocative in a way that's less than dignified. So covering my hair isn't about being unattractive, and yes, I can wear as beautiful a wig as I can afford. Basically, it could get to be quite costly. It doesn't always define me as a Jewish woman, as an Orthodox Hasidic Jewish woman. And sometimes that's the way I want to be seen. When I do want to be seen that way, I will not choose to wear a wig. I'll choose to wear something else, because that immediately makes me visibly somehow different. And then I'll choose something which is less likely to be in the height of fashion and much more apparent as just truly a hair covering. Very often that's not the choice. I was struck by what was said earlier in terms of being seen as a religious woman and having the ability then to minister to those that want some sort of religious experience. And in fact, that's happened when I could be speaking to somebody for, you know, a whole evening, and then it turns out I'm, you know, an Orthodox Hasidic woman. And then this person will say to me, oh, could you give me a blessing that, or whatever. So then that sort of gives me the role of being religious, somehow makes me a partner with God, as if that were any different from anybody else. So that's been, in terms of a challenge, that's been interesting, because in that case my feeling is always, I can't bless you. God blesses. The two of us together could pray perhaps, but it's not that the fact that I live a life that's quote-unquote religious is any more, gives me any more authority or ability than anybody else. I'd like to know what you're thinking, what some of your questions are.
And so indeed, let's open it up to questions. And if you could just say your name and then ask your question, that would be great.
Sure. My name is Kate. Thank you for this presentation and speaking about your perception of veil. And please forgive me if my question is ignorant. I'm still learning about why women choose to veil and what this represents to them. And I'm wondering about the two different, I guess, two of the many different ways that you could look at the choice of veiling. It could be seen as a reflection of your, let's say, spiritual relationship with God. And you especially you, Dr. Sayeed, you mentioned that this reflects your relationship with God. But also could be seen as the gender relationship, because we're talking about covering your hair, in the context of, let's say, don't attract unwanted attention from men. So is it for you more about relationship with God or relationship with men? Or maybe both?
Well, I mean, I think it's really hard to tease all those things out and say one is more than another. I mean, I can't change who I am as a female. I mean, and I can't change who I am as someone who is. No, I was just saying that I think it's hard to weigh one more than the other. I mean, certainly for me, the relationship I have with God is as a human being, right? But it's also as a gendered human being. It's also as, you know, it has, not that God sees me and sees gender, but that in my totality, I can't take away the things that God has made me, whether that's my racial composition or my gender or all the abilities that I have or I lack. So in relating to God, all of those things are part of the equation. So I'm not sure that it's a problem for me that it's a gendered relationship with God, and I'm not sure that it needs to be. I mean, if I am covering myself because I'm having a gendered relationship to God, is that I don't feel that's a problem, but other people might. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if I'm making sense or answering your question, or if others want to comment.
I just want to certainly reinforce what you said.
Maybe hold the mic up a little.
In terms of a relationship with God, we all have gendered relationships with God. You know, just as was just mentioned, it is who I am. I am a woman. My relationship with God is that of a woman, not of a man. And in fact, you know, in my own life, where there are sometimes different obligations for men and for women in their relationship with God, not in terms of each other, that's a given. That's, you know, as was just said by Dr. Sayeed, race, gender, that's something that God's created, and I can't do otherwise. I can't be otherwise. In terms of a gendered relationship with men, well, again, for myself, and now I speak from the perspective of Judaism, I think the core there was a dignity. Being unavailable to any man once I'm married, well, that's something that has to come from me, being projected. In some ways, that's apparent because I'm wearing a ring. If I'm not obviously in my attire, it's not obvious that I'm unavailable to other men, that means that comes from me. In other words, I have to know that. But the actual covering my hair is because God says so, not because I have to project that to anybody else. That, whether or not I project that, becomes a personal choice. But I cover my hair the same reason I light candles or eat kosher or keep Shabbat. It's because as a Jewish woman, this is mandated for me. So it really is all about a relationship with God and not a relationship with anybody else. Does that answer your question?
Sure. So I guess that leads me to the conclusion that what God envisioned for you as what's appropriate or not somewhat takes under account the fact that men, let's say, are attracted by the look of your hair. Right?
Well, yes and no, because as I said before, my hair is not attractive anymore. It used to be 40 years ago. So it's not about being unattractive to men. In fact, if I wanted to, you know, if I was someone who wanted to be attractive, once I'm married, I should kind of curtail that. But it has much more to do with what you project. And that's what's kind of underscored all the time. It's not about, oh, don't look at her, she's unattractive. You know, make myself unattractive so no guy's going to look at me. It's not about that at all. But it is about a demeanor and comportment that's sort of dignified enough that were there to be some attraction, I could make very clear that I'm not available. But it's not about, you know, I'll be ugly so nobody's going to look at me. Not at all. Just something that my husband did once comment when someone said something about a wig that was just like much more beautiful than sometimes a woman's hair. And my husband said, indeed. He said, indeed. But no man dreams about caressing his wife's wig.
I mean, the idea of attraction too, I mean, it's, you know, in saying something
like that I'm covering myself because I don't want to be attractive to men, it's assuming God isn't in the equation, right? I mean, there's nothing there that's talking about what God has made attractive to us, right? So might be just as equally attractive to someone with my hair covered as not, right? So I think in all of those situations, it's not about who you're attracting or not attracting, but rather your relationship with God. And again, this could be different for different people. Just because us three feel this way, it doesn't mean that another woman would say the same thing. I mean, I think it's a very personalized conversation you have and what you make of it. Sorry.
Other questions?
My name's Madeline. I was wondering if any of the panelists could talk about traditions in any of your faiths that ask men to come with their head in some way, like the yarmulke for Jewish men, or I know some Muslim men wear with their cap some sorts of tags. I was just interested in that. If you feel that's related at all to the
And in the Catholic tradition, well, we were talking about it the other day, the priests in the Archdiocese of New York, and in some of our older movies, you'll see the priest always had to have his head covered when he was out. He wore a hat. Our bishops and the Pope all have a mitre, but that has more to do with their position as opposed to something else mandated. I think it's different with them. And traditionally, with the Christian male, there is no head covering that I'm aware of. No.
I think that Islam requires modesty of all people, whether they're men or women. So the idea of covering one's body is there for men as well. I think there's a difference between what is asked and what is practiced, for sure. And I think men also expect women to uphold the guidelines for modesty much more than they impose those guidelines on themselves. So I think all of those things can definitely be talked about. And I think also within the Islamic framework, the guidelines for modesty are different depending on whether you're a man or a woman. So certainly you do see, men covering with a kufi or something. But I think, again, just like the scarf, that means different things for different people. And I think there's definitely a conversation that we need to have across genders within the Muslim community, just about what it means and the whole issue of choice and control and power, because all of those things are connected to the different differences in how men and women dress.
For Jewish men, the yarmulke, as it's become very commonly known, yarmulke actually stems from the words Yira Me'elaka, fear of God. And basically it's not a yarmulke or a kippah that a man has to wear. It's anything that's on his head. The reason being that he must always recognize that there's God above him. So basically there's nothing as certain as that is actually feeling something on your head. Today, for the most part in the Western world, men will also wear specifically a kippah because it identifies them. Immediately seeing that there is identification. However, in certain parts of the world, they'll decidedly not wear a kippah because it identifies them. I have a brother-in-law in France working in government offices, and he's very careful not to wear his kippah because he doesn't want to be identified when it gets risky as being Jewish, as when my husband was traveling in Turkey, and their, apparel of religious identification not allowed, so again, but the law is just that he has to have something on his head, whatever it is. So baseball cap, wig, whatever. Yeah, you don't see many of those, but it would serve to satisfy the law.
Other questions?
I would like to know what's mandated for the Christian in the Bible for the women to cover if they have, like, for the Jewish after getting married, a need to cover themselves, like in Islam. What's mandated in
Let me just repeat her question, which is if it's mandated in the Bible for Christian women to cover their
Yes.
hair after they've gotten married or at any other time.
Exactly.
Not, yes, and I can't quote where, I'm sorry, I can't quote where it is. St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians in Scripture specifically talks about women covering their hair in worship. So that when women were worshiping, when praying, they had to cover their hair. Many Christian denominations have gotten away from that. You will see some Pentecostals, and maybe in some European countries where a woman would cover her hair with the mantilla, with a scarf. Particularly in some African countries, the women will always cover their hair for worship. But in 1 Corinthians, I believe it is where St. Paul speaks specifically about covering the hair. And
Is that for both unmarried and married?
yes, that's just for worship, for worshiping. Yes.
So it applies to, she was saying for both married and
For
unmarried.
both married and unmarried women, yeah. The hair covering.
As a young kid growing up in the Catholic Church many, many years ago, women were never allowed to enter the church without something on their head. They had to have either a hat or a veil, or sometimes they resorted to
Doily.
wearing just these white
Doilies.
type thing. And of course, the men could never enter the church with a hat on. They always had to take their hat off. The women always had something on. I just wanted to make a comment on, you had clarified something for me. I see a lot of Hasidic women in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I see that they're wearing wigs, but I never recognize the reason that they're wearing a wig is to cover their real hair. I often wondered why they were wearing wigs, but it never occurred to me that they're wearing hair to cover their real hair.
So that's
Now I
actually
know.
the point, right? It's about what Jewish law requires, that my hair be covered. How I decide to cover my hair just doesn't matter. And that's where you'll see differences in various communities, cultures, societies, and someone will wear wigs with something on top of it, so that they're covering their hair, but it shouldn't seem as if they weren't covering their hair. But that's all, it's personal and cultural, and not based in Jewish law. And that's really the distinction that I wanted to make, that it's covering hair. However, and then there are wigs and there are wigs.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. It's true.
Yes, hi. Great conversation, thank you. I'd just like to go back to that question about whether or not men are mandated with a certain dress code. And I'd just like to reference, and certainly we need to do a lot more research and study on the subject. But the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the example for us. And depending on cultural
Thank you very much, Sister Aisha. Any other questions? Chloe.
Hi, thank you so much. And I just wanted to ask a little bit about the study I heard somewhere about, maybe it was in the context of the French debate around full coverings in schools, about research showing that teachers were less likely to call on girls who were covered. And if that's something that you've heard, if you have ever experienced, I guess this is mostly for you, Sarah, have you ever experienced a time when, I'm just curious what you think about when it applies to girls, and the question of if, empirical evidence runs up against, the process of girls' leadership or achievement, if it is in fact the case that they're more likely to be, called on in school or selected as serious, sports participants, or do you have any views on that as it relates, I guess, to public policy?
I don't really know about any studies like that, but I do think that it goes back to what I was saying before about what people think the relationship is to covering and choice. And I think once we assume that somebody who's covered has less choice, there might be a tendency to put other kinds of characteristics on that person, just that maybe they're not as assertive, that they're not fit to be a leader because they're not exercising their choice, which would then impact, whether or not we push girls forward. So I think there is a cultural assumption we have that choice underlies covering, and that it's an inverse relationship. So but I don't know about any studies.
Well, I'm just really talking about girls, though. When you're talking about, the question is, can a child, as you quite rightly point out, so many of our choices are shaped by the cultural expectations of, 13-year-old will, be drawn to wearing whatever the culture sort of, or their family. I think choice becomes more problematic the younger one is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think there are examples of, young women, young girls across all of our cultures that are really making strides at, becoming athletes, powerhouses, in so many different ways, while being covered. That it doesn't have to be a limiting factor, and.
I think that's true. I think what Dr. Sayeed said is that there's certain assumptions that are made, and we're kind of socialized to think a certain way. So first of all, we think religious, fundamentalist, traditionalist, somehow versus modern. And it seems to fall into that. And I think it's just a matter of, the ignorance of the masses. I know that for myself, this has happened when I'm introduced as a Hasidic woman and referred to my daughter, who's a doctor. People are surprised. I think, why is it surprising? So I think those are just sort of basic sociological assumptions. Also the assumption that making choices about how I want to present myself, especially for young girls, especially through the teenage years, where it's very difficult to be different from the norm, and the norm is whatever big advertising decides the norm is going to be. There's very little in terms of choice, and I very much agree with what Dr. Sayeed said. Choices are made for us. When people say something, whatever the trends, the fashions, individuals don't decide that for sure. We go to shop and, we buy what's available, basically. But within that, when someone has to, at the age of 12 or 13 or 14, for a girl especially, make a choice to be dressed more dignified, to present herself in a way that she sees not as sleazy or provocative or just really more dignified, then there are assumptions made about her, which is unfortunate. And I do know of a study, but now I can't quite put my finger on it, I don't remember it. but a study that was done in Hebrew day schools. And it really focused more on same gender education or differentiated education, and how girls and boys did academically when they were in class of the same gender. But it also focused a little bit on those that were seen as more religious or less religious, more traditional or less traditional, and how teachers or administrations would then, like what the expectations were. And that was very interesting to see as well. So I think that has to be next big education in, the general masses. And I think it's happening as we see, men and women in their religious life not excluding themselves from any facet of Western life. Is that what you were asking? Not exactly.
I guess I was thinking more about the way, studies aside, the way so much of communication happens through your face. That there's several more sort of muscles. There's a lot of communication comes through facial expressions and body language, I guess. And that if one is in a position where your facial expressions, can't be read as easily, does that put you at a disadvantage in a pedagogical context? That was sort of my question.
So I guess that would be in the category of any type of, it's not just about covering. Imagine somebody who spoke with a stutter. Does that put that person at a disadvantage in school? Wasn't there recently a case in the Times about a teacher who didn't call on a student who was taking too long to ask a question because of his stuttering? So of course there might be many areas of quote-unquote disadvantage. Of course then the responsibility is on the adult in the situation. If we're talking about in school, children in the classroom, the teachers, then certainly the onus is on the teacher to make sure that somehow he or she is able to communicate with that student, regardless of what might be an inhibiting factor. So whether it's something physiological or emotional or garmental, the teacher has to be able to. Again, it goes back to educating the masses. That more to the point of your question.
Well, we're out of time now, so I know people have had other comments to make, and I think it's just shows how interesting this topic is, and we did think about whether to have men, especially maybe a Sikh man, but because the exhibit was Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women, we decided to, or I guess not the royal we, I decided to just keep it like this. But at any rate, a final round of applause. And the photographs are from the Institute for Women's Studies in the Arab World of Lebanese American University. And Lebanese American University is generously hosting a reception this afternoon from 4 to 6 here. So please, the exhibit is up all day, so please now feel free to take the time to look at the photographs, but also please feel free to come back this afternoon for the reception. And again, many thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank you. And there are brochures available here